This is GPS, the global public square. Welcome to all of you in the United States and around the world. I'm Bianna Golodriga in for Fareed Zakaria this week, and I'm coming to you from New York. Well, President Biden just landed 75 minutes ago in Bali, where this year's G20 Leaders Summit is being held. He arrived from Cambodia, where on Saturday he attended another summit for ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Biden had a meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister and the South Korean President before getting on Air Force One. CNN's Ivan Watson joins me now from Bali. So, Ivan, one of the president's goals at the ASEAN summit was to reassure nations in that region that the U.S. supports their economic and political stability in the face of an increasingly emboldened China. Did he succeed with that?
Well, that was a message he was bringing to this meeting, saying that the U.S. is engaged in the region. For example, calling ASEAN, that 10-member Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the heart of his Indo-Pacific strategy, and stressing how engaged the U.S. is going to be in the region. It didn't help, perhaps, that he mistakenly referred to the host country, Cambodia, as Colombia at least twice. But despite those gaffes, he was able to bring an upgrade in relations to the table. The U.S. and ASEAN have formally announced the start of a comprehensive strategic partnership. He says he's going to try to bring $850 million worth of assistance to Southeast Asian nations. And he got these kind of statements made, for instance, alongside the leaders of Korea and Japan, a commitment to the region to maintaining a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. And what that's doing is basically they're saying they want to maintain the status quo. They want to maintain stability. It's a challenge to things like China claiming virtually all of the South China Sea for itself. This is the U.S. basically standing up for smaller countries like the Philippines and Vietnam, which also claim part of the South China Sea. And this is a call for peace when it comes to, for example, North Korea and its nuclear weapons program and the many missiles, the dozens of them that have been launching in recent months. But countries in the region are also concerned about the escalating tensions between Beijing and Washington. So what Biden was able to do was to say, hey, I'm meeting with you guys, I'm listening to you, and then I'm going to Bali and I'm going to meet for the first time as U.S. president face to face with the Chinese leader Xi Jinping to show that I'm ready to try to work to try to stem and stop these relations from getting worse, from potentially spiraling into a possible conflict. And that was welcomed, for instance, by the Prime Minister of Singapore, who says, good, we need to make sure that these relations don't deteriorate further. Some of these countries want the U.S. engaged, but they do not want to be forced into a position to have to choose between Beijing or Washington. Bianna?
Yeah, the symbolism of this visit as well as its substance is notable. Thanks, Ivan Watson. We appreciate your time. Well, now on to President Biden's next set of meetings at the G20. That's the group of 20 of the world's largest economies. Many of America's closest friends and allies will be there, but so will Russia and China. Vladimir Putin chose not to attend this year after much controversy about whether to disinvite him. Russia will still be represented, but by its foreign minister. Chinese President Xi Jinping will be there, and Biden will meet him tomorrow. So what can we expect? Joining me now are Ian Brimmer and Ann Applebaum. Ian is the president of Eurasia Group, a global political risk consultancy, and Ann Applebaum, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and a staff writer for The Atlantic. Welcome, both of you. So, Ian, let's begin with you. All eyes will be on this important meeting between President Biden and President Xi, their first in-person meeting since President Biden has been in office, though we should note that they do know each other and their relationship goes back many years. Over the weekend, President Biden reiterated his goals for the meeting, and the bar is pretty low here, but he said his intentions are to lay out each other's red lines, as well as make clear that the U.S. is looking for competition but not conflict. Will he get more clarity out of that?
I think he will. The two leaders do respect each other, even if there's not a lot of trust in the relationship right now. And the mood music in the last couple of weeks in the run-up to the meeting has been very different than what we saw after Pelosi's trip to Taiwan. A fair amount of high-level bilateral meetings, including John Kerry and his counterpart at the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, as well as an exchange of surprisingly upbeat and warm letters between Biden and Xi Jinping at this National Committee for U.S.-China Relations. Look, the U.S. is engaged in a policy of at least limited containment on the semiconductor issue, and that is new. Definitely causes more confrontation. But I think that the Biden-Xi Jinping meeting is going to surprise on the upside and create a little more stabilization in a relationship that, frankly, has been deteriorating quite a bit over the last months.
You're talking about the export controls that the U.S. has put in place recently over China and some of its technology there.
Last month,
and some are referring to this meeting as the first superpower meeting of the Cold War version 2.0. What really is at stake here?
What's at stake is whether the world that was created by the United States and its allies after the Second World War, a world in which there were treaties in which large countries more or less didn't invade or occupy their neighbors, in which there was forms of international law that people obeyed, whether that continues. Both for America and for China, there have been huge advantages out of that system, and much more recently, Russia has tried to disrupt it. And there was some question as to what was the Chinese position. Were the Chinese content with playing by the rules as they existed up until now, or did they want to change them? And I think that's the conversation, that's the argument that you'll see played out at this meeting and in ones that follow over the next few weeks and months.
Yeah, also on the agenda, Ian, is North Korea, and that rogue nation has fired more missiles this year than in any year past. Do you think there's any sort of consensus that Biden and Xi can make and come to in this meeting in hopes of reining Kim Jong-un in?
Not really, although I do think that there's some alignment. The Chinese don't want the North Koreans rocking the boat with all of these missile tests in the same way that the Chinese would much rather that the Russians find a way to stop the war in Ukraine. That's very interesting, right? The fact that unlike Russia, where there is a strong effort to undermine the international status quo, the Chinese really want to see more stability right now, especially given how poorly their economy is performing, given the difficulties of upholding the zero COVID issue. And so, again, I think that despite the fact there are all sorts of areas of confrontation between the U.S. and China, and rightly so. I mean, there are plenty of problems that the Americans have on national security. The Chinese are a principal adversary. But actually, the timing of this meeting is one where both presidents do want to actually use common interests to calm some of the big global challenges that exist right now. And I think you'll see some of that on North Korea. I think you'll see more of it on Russia, frankly.
Yeah, and to pick up on that, and you mentioned this earlier, but there had been some concern early in this war and in Russia's invasion of Ukraine that China would perhaps be supplying Russia with military aid and ammunition. We have not seen that come to fruition as of yet, but we are seeing the North Koreans and the Iranians step in their place and sell them weapons. And do you think there's any consensus that can come out of this G20 summit to help make that effort a bit more difficult on the part of the Iranians and North Korea?
So the Chinese attitude towards the war in Ukraine has been ambivalent. They clearly supported the invasion to start with. The Russians met with them early in the year, and there seemed to be a kind of consensus. They put out a joint statement. It looked like the Chinese were going to support the war effort. I think that was when the Russians were telling them it was going to last 3 days, it would be over quickly, and it wouldn't matter. Clearly, as it's gone on, they've been more careful in what they say. They've changed some of their rhetoric, although they do still use they propagate the Russian propaganda lines in their own media and in the media. They control quite a lot of media all around the world, and they push the idea that the real source of this conflict is NATO and so on. It seems to be, my guess is that it's not in their interest for the war to spread or continue. And of course, they have influence certainly over North Korea, and they could help restrain this war if they wanted to. I assume that's going to be one of the main topics of discussion at this summit, is whether the Chinese will agree to put pressure on the Russians to restrict their trade, to persuade them to stop fighting because of the instability that this war is creating in Europe and around the world.
Yeah, Ian, on the economic front, it does appear that the U.S. is making a significant attempt to decouple itself from China, which would have been shocking to hear that headline just 15 years ago, yet here we are. That having been said, other countries, particularly Germany, is not quite there yet. Their chancellor was just in China. That is their largest trading partner. And though there's more pressure on Germany to diversify its investments, they've doubled down on some of their deals just during this visit alone. Can the U.S. successfully decouple from China if Germany, Europe's largest economy, is not on board?
No, unlike the Russia policy, where all of America's allies are on board and there's a really strong level of coordination under U.S. leadership, that's not true in China policy at all. The White House was trying for months before they announced these export controls on semiconductors to get American allies like the Germans, the French, but even the Japanese on board. They failed. They went ahead with the policy anyway. Look, the U.S. is, of course, the most important economy, and allies will eventually more or less get on board specifically with that part of decoupling. But more broadly, frankly, you won't see that from the allies. And one other thing I would mention is outside of the technology space, most American corporations in the private space are more aligned with the Germans, the French, and the Japanese than they are with the U.S. government, Democrat and Republican together. So that's an interesting area to watch over the coming months.
And a challenging one at that. All right, sit tight, panel. Next on GPS, the midterm election results surprised many in the United States, but how were they received overseas? I'll ask the panel when we come back. According to the Pew Research Center, America's image abroad took a major hit during the presidency of Donald Trump, but it rebounded after Biden took office. So how is the world responding to the performance of Biden's Democrats in Tuesday's midterms? Ann Applebaum joins us again from her listening post in Poland, and Ian Bremmer, who talks to world leaders for a living, is back with us from Chicago. And let me start with you, because the morning after the midterms, which I just have to be honest feels like a month ago, you tweeted, "House is a toss-up, is not the news I thought I would wake up to here in Central Europe." Simon Schama wrote in the FT this weekend that American democracy surprises us all again. Overall, election deniers and isolationists did not have a very good night. What are European leaders in European capitals responding to that with?
Look, I think it's important to understand that most foreign leaders for years and years dealt with Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, and treated them more or less the same. They understood that there were some differences between them, but that there were some bipartisan consensus in American foreign policy. The Trump administration changed that, and also the Trump administration led many to fear that the United States would no longer serve as the lead.
Oh. I believe we lost her shot there. Ian, if you want to step in, what are world leaders telling you in regard to not only what must have surprised them, clearly surprised a lot of experts here in the United States as well?
Well, first of all, I think I agree with where Ann was going there, which is that allies around the world can work with Democrats and Republicans very easily. They had a problem with Trump. Specifically, not all of them. We know that there are countries like Hungary, for example, Israel, the Saudis, the Indians that did well with Trump individually. But most American allies felt like he was a threat to U.S. democracy in a singular way, in a way that DeSantis would not be, that no one else on the national political stage, Democrat or Republican. So two big positive things come out of this election in terms of U.S. foreign policy and the way the Americans are perceived. First of all, the idea that almost all of the election deniers that were running for office to oversee elections, governorships, as well as Secretary of State positions in key swing states, they all lost. Trump supported them all. They all lost. That's a really big deal because it means the likelihood of a constitutional crisis, the likelihood of a broken election in the United States in 2024 that would truly undermine America's position with its allies has reduced very substantially on the back of these midterms. The second point is that Trump himself has been significantly damaged. And if DeSantis ends up, or someone else, as a major Republican flag bearer and is in election in 2024 against Biden or someone else on the Democratic side, that won't be seen as a problem. You can go back to a United States that's perceived as doesn't really matter that much, whether it's a Democrat or Republican that runs it. They're still going to have the same challenges with American unilateralism, exceptionalism, the same opportunities from being the ally of the most powerful country in the world. So I do think for most countries around the world, this election came as a very substantial relief. And who controls the House or Senate actually matters a lot less than the two issues I just raised.
We have Ann back, thankfully. So, Ann, President Xi may be coming to this G20 summit just having that third unprecedented term announced. But as we discussed earlier, there are a lot of internal headwinds that he is facing. I'm just curious, given these election results here in the United States and the fact that President Biden had the best midterm performance of any president in the past 20 years, does that give him added momentum going into this meeting with Xi tomorrow?
So it absolutely does. It gives him momentum, both because he's seen as having the support of his country, but also because it puts him back at the center of the democratic world. He will be seen as having the support of allies, as somebody who can garner a lot of support. Look, the Chinese were watching very closely U.S. and allied behavior in Ukraine. As an example of what the NATO alliance can do together, what the democracies can do together. And clearly Biden was a very important piece of that story. He was the one who galvanized the allies. He came to the aid of the Ukrainians. They've been very clear in their messaging, including in the last 24 hours, about continuing the war until it ends. The Chinese are listening to that. They know that it's a message to them as well. It's a message to them about Taiwan. And they'll see Biden as somebody who's strengthened by this, and rightly so.
And quickly, before you go, I wanted to ask you about your most recent Atlantic piece. The title is "The West is Enabling Putin's Nuclear Threats. Western Leaders Should Deter Russia's Leader, Not Give in to Him." So far, we have not seen Putin follow through on his veiled and sometimes not so veiled nuclear threats. And the latest example of an embarrassment to the country, and yet no real response from him in terms of any nuclear attack, is this retreat from Kherson earlier this week. What is your message in this piece to the U.S. administration officials specifically? I believe we lost Ann. Ian, if you want to step in on that.
Sorry, Ann. Yeah, no, of course. I mean, I read the piece as well, thankfully. And look, the message is that the Russians are in an incredibly difficult position. And frankly, we talked about Xi Jinping in the last segment. The Chinese leader came out publicly and quite surprised German Chancellor Scholz during their meeting when he was willing to say that there should be no nuclear use in the Eurasian landmass. And of course, that is a message from the Chinese leader to his best friend on the global stage, Vladimir Putin. So I think there is less concern about the use of a tactical nuclear weapon in the coming weeks and months. But there's a great concern still that, Putin is in a really an untenable long-term position. His economy is going to collapse on the back of these very tough sanctions. The NATO is, of course, enlarging, and Ukraine will end up being the best equipped and best trained army on the ground in Europe. None of which works for Russia. So the real question is what happens if Russia is becoming a rogue over time, and how that's going to be contained, an area where NATO is going to have to stay very close together, very aligned for many years to come.
Yeah, a rogue maybe, but still a rogue with more nukes than any other country in the world. Sure. All right, Ann and Ian. Ian, thanks for stepping in there. Thanks for reading Ann's pieces for us as well. I'm sure she'll appreciate that. Thanks for your time. Well, next on GPS, Russian forces withdrew from a critical part of Ukraine this week. It was a great Ukrainian success. So what does it mean for the larger war at stake? I'll explore when we come back.